So with no further ado, I'd like to thank you for coming tonight for this episode of In Conservation With. I'm joined by Lawrence B., who is the lead author. He's the lead author on this book, Britain Spiders, and there's a lot of spiders in here. So we'll be talking about spiders tonight. I'd like to also mention the sponsors, Leica Sport Optics and also King's Place Music Foundation. This is part of their Nature Unwrapped season, which lasts a year. So thank you guys for sponsoring. And with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Lawrence to this evening's proceedings. So Lawrence, how are you and where are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And I'm in Whitney, which is just outside Oxford.
And where, just out of interest, as a young Lawrence, where were you kind of raised?
I was raised in north of England, in Lancashire, and people tell me I've still got a hint of a Lancashire accent, but I can never recognise it. And then I moved, when I went away further education, I moved down to Nottingham, and I spent my late teens, 20s, working at Sherwood Forest, at the country park in Sherwood Forest, Robin Hood and all that.
Exactly. I went to Sherwood Forest actually a few years ago to do a recording of a show for the Radio 4, and it is a really quite an interesting place. I mean, to see those ancient trees, the ancient oaks, those gnarled oaks. You don't often see that kind of thing in the UK. In fact, looking at your resume, I mean, you are an educator, you're a natural history expert, and one of the things that is on your list of areas of knowledge are ancient trees and oak woodlands. Now, quickly diverting for a second, not many of those left in the UK, is there?
There aren't, unfortunately, although recently the Ancient Tree Forum, combined with the Woodland Trust, set out to count the number of ancient trees that we actually have in the UK. And I think their aim was to find, I think it was 100,000, and they did achieve that. So we do have more than we were expecting to find. But we have less ancient woodland, ancient trees, we have less than the rest of Europe put together. So we're still sort of fairly poorly off for them, even though as individual trees, they are fantastically important. The fact that we don't have the numbers means that, the biodiversity that's associated with that sort of habitat is consequently reduced, unfortunately.
When does a tree become ancient?
Well, it depends what sort of tree you're talking about. If we're talking about an oak tree, anything beyond about, they used to say there were 300 years growing, 300 years maturing, and then 300 years dying. I would say that anything from about 400 to 500 years, they're beginning to show signs of being ancient. But you can have veteran trees as well, and veteran trees have the characteristics of ancient trees that may be much younger. When I say they have the characteristics, they may have suffered in some way. For instance, an oak tree may have lost a limb in a lightning strike, and that is showing characteristics of an ancient tree because the bark is being exposed and so on. But then if you're talking about silver birch trees, an ancient silver birch tree might be, I don't know, anything beyond 120 years old, because that is, they're a fast-growing tree, and they tend not to live much beyond that age. They will start to show characteristics, and the value of ancient trees in lots of ways is how they form part of an ecological web in terms of all the characteristics that they have can offer sort of invertebrates, mammals, birds, the whole sort of range, and they provide a sort of a nature reserve within themselves, in a sense. I mean, an ancient oak tree, can support hundreds of different invertebrates, and then you add on the lichens and the birds and the mammals and so on. So they're really can be quite sort of significant in themselves. And when you've got a group of them growing together, as you have at Sherwood and in one or two other locations, then it is really quite an important habitat in providing for that biodiversity.
So it looks like the future will be a whole bunch of ancient trees in England anyway, because people seem to plant trees at the same age in the same area. So we're going to have a hundred trees the same age, aren't we?
I'm a little, yeah, we need to be planting trees, but the problem is if all these trees which are being planted, they need to be maintained and they need to be thinned and they need to be managed. And that is the question which is never properly answered. How is this going to happen? It's all very well planting trees, but it's their aftercare, which is often as important as planting the trees themselves. And in addition, I think that this big aim to be planting lots and lots of trees can actually not be very good for the rest of the environment in some cases, where habitats, important habitats, are being destroyed so that trees can be planted. So we might be losing sort of heathland sites or other important rare habitats because people are being encouraged to plant lots and lots, thousands and thousands of trees. So it needs to be done very carefully, and I'm not certain that that has been sort of understood at the moment, at least. Hopefully it will be in the future.
Well, it better be soon. But in these woodlands, obviously, is quite a great habitat for spiders, of course. So yeah. When did you get bitten by the spider bug, for want of a better phrase?
I started working in Sherwood Forest. I started as a volunteer, actually. I'd just left college. I'd had one or two jobs, but during that sort of period of just having left, I realised that there might be opportunities available by going and doing some voluntary work, which is what I did up in Sherwood for a summer. And then I found that they were looking for more staff, more range staff, and I applied for the job. Prior to the interview, I asked the other staff, the permanent staff there, what sort of questions were asked at interview, and they told me, well, you've got to have an interest in some aspect of natural history. And there were already people interested in the birds and the trees and fungi and mammals, but nobody had expressed any interest in invertebrates of any description, and spiders and beetles and that sort of thing in particular. Now, it was a site of special scientific interest when I joined, and part of the reason for that was the ancient oak woodland and the importance of that habitat for invertebrates, and yet nobody was actually focusing in on those. So I said at my interview that I didn't know a great deal about them, but I felt there was a need for this to be looked at. And anyway, I got the job, and within a week of me starting, there was a little piece in the local paper saying that the country park, Sherwood Forest Country Park, had received a grant from the World Wildlife Fund for carrying out an arachnid survey of Sherwood Forest. And Countryside Ranger Lawrence B was going to be the person coordinating this. So I was literally thrown in at the deep end. And if you know anything about the press and spiders, any spider story gets picked up by the press in a big way. And this is what they did. And I found myself appearing on BBC local television and also on Radio 4 talking to, on the PM programme, talking to the interviewer, who I'm sure a lot of people will remember, a chap called Gordon Clough. And I did a 20-minute session with him, and which turned out to be 2 or 3 minutes on the PM programme, and also appearing on the local TV. And so, you know, I couldn't not do spiders after that. So I went out and I spent my first year just going out and setting pitfall traps and collecting the material. And then after a season of doing that, I was lucky enough to be sent on a spider identification course with the Field Studies Council down at Flatford Mill in East Anglia. So that's how it all started.
Okay. Before I ask you my next question, there's a couple of people saying that your voice is not as clear as it could be.
Right.
So I don't know how we can, if your full signal is there, for example, or you may need to be even closer to the system.
That's probably the case, because I do have problems with this.
But anyway, whilst you're looking at that, let's not waste any time in terms of thinking about computers. Why are spiders up there or even above the hatred of wasps in this country? Why do people have this innate fear of legs?
I suspect it is something that has been passed down through the generations. You know, in medieval times, one had two extremes. The bumblebee was revered and seen as a useful creature to have around, and honeybees as well, in providing honey, but they were actually seen as really good things to have around. On the other end of the scale, spiders were seen to be pretty awful things, and the old medieval name for spiders was atacop, which means poison head. And this is what people felt about them, that you know, they had to get rid of them. If spiders were around, they didn't want to know, and they just had to sort of make sure that they were avoided. And I believe that this is something which has just been passed down over the generations. You talk to a lot of people who say they're scared of spiders, and they come out with a tale of when they were children, that their brother would put one down their neck or hide one in the bed, and they were scared out of their wits by, you know, practical jokes being played upon them by their siblings. And even if youngsters are interested, as a lot of them are, in creepy crawlies, it's mum who is saying, "Oh, don't touch that. It's you know, it'll cause you harm," or whatever. And it's something which they've learned from their parents, if you like, and it's gone back through the generations. And I think this is a fairly strong influence on our present situation, where a lot of people have this arachnophobia, this fear of spiders. It can be solved and it can be sorted out, and it's amazing how, by just gently being persuaded to hold a spider in your hand, can actually make a huge difference. We've been, as a society, the British Arachnological Society, we've been attending the bird fair for a number of years, and we've had people who come and see our stall and stand away from it because they're scared of spiders, and you try to gently encourage them to come a bit closer. And we had one woman who came, and she said, "Oh, I came last year, and yeah, I did have a look, but I'm still scared." And I had a live spider with me, and I said, "Well, how about just having this on your hand?" And she very tentatively agreed and held this spider for a couple of minutes. And it made such a difference for her that she'd been able to conquer this fear that she'd had simply by doing it in a gentle, informal way. So it can be done. And I mean, I know the Natural History Museum, or is it London Zoo down in London, run courses for people to get over their arachnophobia. So there you are.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm a naturalist, I'm a presenter,
Yep.
and I remember doing a Spring Watch piece, and I was talking about harvestmen, and they said, David, there's a harvestman over there. I want you to put your hand in, in front of the camera and pick it up. And I just froze, and I said, could we not get a hand double? But and I kind of touched it, pointed it at it. But I think there is an innate situation sometimes. But anyway,
Yeah.
let's learn more about spiders.
Okay.
Let's learn more.
Right. So let's see if I can get this presentation up for you. Where are we?
And of course, the book you've written is pretty hefty. There's a lot of spiders here. So I'd be very interested to ask you a few questions about them once you get your presentation up. So, for example, as a birder, I like to sort of see what birds I've seen. I look in the book of a region, and I think to myself, how many of those birds have I seen? What birds have I not seen yet, should I say? So, is it the same for arachnophiles? Do they, for example, do you have a spider list? Do you go and twitch spiders?
Not really. I suppose in some cases that might apply, but it's very much more you go out and an interesting site and you can see what you can find. If you happen to come across something which is really rare, all the better. But it's not a question of, oh, we've seen this there, let's go there and tick it off. So it's not quite the same sort of thing.
Okay. So we've got your presentation up now.
Let me just, that's it, right, we just need to go back one. Okay, so we talk about the arachnids as a group of invertebrates, and they include not only the spiders, but also things like harvestmen, which you've just mentioned, which are not the same as spiders. They have 8 legs, sure, but only one part of the body, and the eyes are set up on a little turret just around there. Did you see the arrow? Is that working?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And then we have a smaller group of arachnids, the false scorpions. Some of these are really tiny. There are about, I suppose, 36 thereabouts species in the UK, as there are harvestmen. We're talking about spiders, we're talking about 670 or thereabouts. And then finally, we have the mites. And I don't talk much about mites, so we'll ignore those. But the false scorpions and the harvestmen are interesting arachnids, and they have their own interesting life histories and ecology and everything else. So we will be focusing on the spiders today. So to just quickly go through basic form, of course they've got 8 legs and 2 parts of the body. This area here is the head and thorax joined together. They're fused together, so there's no sort of distinct separation between the two. Together they're called the cephalothorax. And then we have the abdomen, the 8 legs, 8 eyes generally, occasionally with British species at least 6. About just a handful of species with 6 eyes in the UK. Now the spinnerets, obviously important as the silk, production of silk. A pair of pedipalps here, which on the female look like a short extra pair of legs, but we'll see in a moment how they're important in the male. And there's an epigyne, which is the important part of the female reproductively. This is the genitalia of the female. And then, as we say, the palps, and we can talk about those a little bit more here. So this is a spider you'll see fairly commonly around houses. Spins its web, which is fairly distinctive, has this missing sector, and it's found in corners of window and door frames. The spider illustrated there is a female, and this is what's known as the epigyne, which is on the underside of the female here, just there. The male, rather than having just ordinary palps which taper to a point, has these sort of rather boxing glove-like swellings at the tip of the palp, and contained within that is a very complex structure which enables the male to absorb sperm, which he produces from a small opening under his abdomen, absorb the sperm and then transfer it to the female by inserting the palp into the epigyne. And there we have just a more detailed illustration of, and this is for one of the tiny little money spiders, where this is the male palp, and you can see quite a complex structure which is inserted into the epigyne on the right there, and it's rather like a key and a lock system. That palp will fit in that epigyne, but won't fit in other epigynes. So the species remains pure in a sense. Okay, so that's just a very, very quick look at the structure. What I'd like to do is today is to just go through some of the main families. We have 38 families of spiders in the UK, which isn't if you think about, the 670 species compared with what we have worldwide, which is, getting on for 48, 49,000, perhaps, around about 50,000 species, and we only have 670. But in terms of the families, there are just over 100 families recorded worldwide, and we have 38 of them are represented in the UK. So we have a good variety of spiders, and in terms of around a third of the families represented in the world, we're doing quite well for such a small area. Atipus, a member of the Untitled family, is the only spider which falls into the group of what we know as megalomorph spiders, i.e. their chelicerae, their jaws here, move up and down, rather like a pickaxe movement, rather than side to side as they do with all our other spiders. And you'll see here, there's a white band, which is muscle, basically, because these jaws, chelicerae, have a huge amount of, when they're catching prey, they're using a huge amount of power to actually get hold of them, and that's when the muscles come into use. Now, what's interesting about Atipus, it's called a purse web spider because it spins a very sort of narrow tube of silk on the surface of the ground, and the rest of the tube disappears underground. So it excavates a vertical tube, and that's lined with silk, and that extends to this sort of purse-like shape above ground. And the spider, the female, as we got here, I think. She'll spend most of her time down at the base of that tube and only come to the surface when an insect, a hapless insect, comes and falls over the surface, and she's able to grab hold of it and pull it through. So that gives them the name purse web spiders. They're not common, but when you see them, you can't really mistake them because of this huge, big, the huge, big jaws, which are about as big as the cephalothorax area here. Right, move on. Sorry. This is a spider in the Scytoides family, Scytoidae, and it's the only one. And it's called the spitting spider because that's what it actually does. It spits out gummy fluid to transfix its prey before it so it can then go along and deal with it at leisure. It's a spider we find in the house occasionally. It's not very common. Surprisingly found or recorded in museums for some reason or other. This is how it catches its prey. So it approaches the prey very gently and carefully and squirts from its jaws, these sort of waving the jaws from side to side. So you get these sticky lines which transfix its prey to the surface, and it can't move. And so the spider is then able to deal with it. They're quite characteristic because they have this very domed carapace or cephalothorax, the doming there, which is actually protecting some fairly big glands which are used to actually squirt out this goo which transfixes the prey. So this is Scytoides thoracica, the only member of the family in the UK, of this family in the UK. Moving quickly on, this is something people I'm sure will be familiar with. This is the daddy long-legged spider, or Pholcus. Seems to have undergone a huge growth in numbers over recent years. Its distribution is now throughout the whole of the country. Here's the female with its egg sac. Here's a bundle of eggs, not in this case protected by silk, and that's really odd for spiders because they normally protect them in a sack of silk. But because these things are live indoors most of the time, then there isn't the same need for those eggs to be protected in the same way. Very, very common, and seems to be taking over in houses from the house spider, which people will, I'm sure, be familiar with. And this is spreading really quite rapidly right up in Scotland now. Probably as a result of dry atmosphere, central heating in houses, it finds it a much more suitable environment to live. There are three families of Sagastrids. There are three what we call tube web spiders. Here are two of them, Sagestris and oculata, and something which is again becoming commoner. This is Florentina. The web they spin is a tubular web going back into a hole in rotting wood, or in this case, an old stone wall. And at the, sorry, it keeps jumping. At the entrance to the web, there are radiating lines of silk. And the spider sits at the entrance, waiting for an insect to perhaps catch one of these lines of silk, and then dashes out and pulls whatever it is back into the tube. And these spiders are really quite clever, because if, for instance, it's a wasp, they'll grab the wasp by its waist and pull it back into the tube so that its sting and its head are facing away from it, and it's not going to cause the spider any danger. And they can, Florentina, as you can see from this photograph here, has quite sort of greenish tinge to the jaw. They're quite large, getting on for about 12 to 15 millimeters body length. And if you entice these out of the web, which we do nowadays with an electric toothbrush just by touching one of the lines of silk, and that simulates an insect struggling. They can give you quite a surprise when they appear. They come out very quickly, and their size, as well as this sort of the green metallic jaws, can be something to, you've got to be prepared for it. Otherwise, the thing will probably move back into its tube before you've had a chance to have a good look at it. So those are Suggestrids. Dysderidae is another fairly impressive spider, and this is called a woodlouse spider simply because it tends to eat woodlice to the exclusion of much else. Found in areas where there are lots of woodlice around. I've had it in my garden. Fairly distinctive colouring, deep red and this sort of beigey abdomen. Known in Australia as a baked bean spider for obvious reasons. Can get quite large, again 10 to 12 millimeters body length, and you can come across these in your garden. I found one when we moved down to where we are now, just when I was clearing up some sort of rubble in the garden. There it was, sitting underneath some stones on the ground. Linyphiidae, these are called the pirate spiders, simply because they tend to go in and pinch the food, go into other spiders' webs and pinch the food, or actually go for the spider itself. They're quite easy to recognize as a family because all of them have these strange humps on their abdomen. There are, I think, three members of the family, or four, yes, four. And they have different numbers of humps. So some have 4 and some have 2. So they are a spider you can actually identify reasonably easily down to family, simply with the naked eye, simply by having a look at it under a hand lens. They aren't huge, but if you see them under a hand lens, these are fairly distinctive shapes that you see. A rarity, this is the ladybird spider, and you might ask, quite justifiably, why it's called a ladybird spider. Well, you need to see the male, and this is the male ladybird spider. Distinctive pattern of red with black spots on the abdomen. The female, on the other hand, is sort of just quite large and a bulky little spider. They're quite big, but almost completely black. Very, very rare indeed, thought to be extinct until they were rediscovered down on the Dorset Heaths, and now it's a protected species, and we don't, or very, very few people know the actual location for these things because we want to protect them, but there's been a very successful reintroduction, well, not reintroduction, young have been bred through, and now new sites have been colonized with new populations of this particular spider. So it's doing quite well. It's quite a success story down there. An interesting spider we call the triangle spider, because that's the type of web it spins. And this is like a section of an orb web, if you like. And the spider is sitting there just at the edge of the web, holding on to it, and actually attached to a twig or whatever it is by a short length of silk from its spinners. So it's actually forming part of the web. When an insect happens to blunder into that web, then the spider just releases silk, spins silk very quickly, so the whole web collapses around its prey, and the thing is not able to escape. Now, this particular spider is, I think, the only one in the UK that doesn't actually have any venom glands. So it doesn't actually paralyze its prey. It just wraps it very tightly in silk. So it's unable to move and then feeds on it in that respect. Here's the spider sitting as part of the web within that line of silk, as I was explaining. So it's holding on here to, that would be this part of the web. So it's holding on to that, and this is the liner silk attaching itself from its spinners to whatever the twig or whatever it's sort of spinning the web from. Not very common, almost exclusively found in old yew trees. Right, a larger family of Theridiids, very varied in size and colouring and pattern and everything else. One feature of some of them is this very upturned abdomen, which is quite characteristic of some of the species of Theridiids. This one in particular, it's quite a small spider, but it's got quite a distinctive colouring with pink and orange and black. And through a hand lens, you would be able to see quite clearly the way the abdomen is upturned. Another member of the same family is that spins an interesting type of web. Here's the spider in its web, and it's actually, the web itself is just a structure to hang some sticky threads from. And the sticky threads are attached to the ground, and when I say sticky, it's just the last section, which has droplets of glue, and anything moving around in this area, it happens to come across one of those, becomes entangled in that, and then the spider just goes down, deals with it, or actually hauls that up to deal with it in the web. The retreat here, the spider, this is the female spider would lay her eggs there, and they would hatch, and she would actually feed them for a short period of time on prey she caught in the web. And then we have other Theridiids. This is a commoner one here. You can see, even though they're quite small compared with this heather blossom, fairly distinct patterns. So that's quite a useful indicator of being able to identify them. It can get extremely small. This is only about 3 millimeters body length. It's on the underside of an oak tree, and you usually recognize it by seeing its egg sac, which is what it's sitting on there, a spiky egg sac. And they're not uncommon. If you look underneath oak leaves in sort of June time, you're likely to come across a good number of Pediscura pallans, tiny little spider. But just look for the egg sac and the spider will be fairly close by. Other Theridiids, and it's one species, but there are 3 different colour forms, and this happens in spiders. You might have a plain yellowish white with a few black spots, or one with 2 red bands, or one with a thick red band. It's all the same species. You can see the egg sac is exactly the same in each of them, and they have the same habit of wrapping the egg sac in a leaf, wrapping it up in a leaf as protection. So it's all the same spider, but they do have these different colour forms. And you probably come across the pale one more commonly, but these 2, you can come across them. And just look for, leaves which are rolled up and secured by silk. And if you open them up, you might possibly find one of these things. Again, we're talking about springtime, late spring, early summer. Moving quickly on. Another group of genus of Theridiids, or Steatodas. Steatoda nobilis is what we know as the noble false widow spider. I think it's had a name change recently, so it might be, just bear with me, check. This is the one. This is the spider which has the infamous press reports about schools being closed due to infestation by the noble false widow spider. The spider is not as dangerous as the press like to make out. And yes, they can bite, and yes, their venom is quite potent, but if they're left alone and not handled, then it's very, very unlikely you're going to suffer any problems with them. Steatota grossa is a close relation, less reported on, let's say, than nobilis. This is the one, and I suspect it's because it's called a widow spider that people get so excited about it and worried about it. It is in the same family as the black widow, but it's a huge family worldwide, and so it's not really a very close relation. Here's the sort of thing, this was what, 7, 8 years ago now, but plague of 10 million false widow spiders on a rampage. This was really going a little bit over the top. And it's a deadly cousin of the black widow. Well, there have been no recorded deaths from spiders in the UK. I'll leave it at that. When we did have this, all this press interest, obviously there was a lot of contact with the society about how concerned should we be about these things. And I was rung up by a radio station in Suffolk, and the first thing the interviewer said to me was he'd just been rung up by a lady who said she'd been chased by 50 of these false widow spiders. And my sort of response to that was, well, why would a small creature like that expend all that energy chasing something for no benefit to itself? And he said, oh yeah, I suppose, yes. And then I went on to talk about, the fact that they do bite, but it was a very rare occurrence, and the health issues involved with it. And I said, well, I wasn't a medical person, but what we were seeing in the press was not the effect of the spider bite, but very much the secondary infection of those wounds, and explained it all. And then the interviewer said, okay, we're now going to talk to a local GP. And he asked him the same sort of questions, and the GP said, well, your previous person you were speaking to has got it exactly right. That's the advice we give, just to seek medical help if you're concerned, and so on and so forth. And I was really quite pleased because, I said I had no medical knowledge, but for it to be backed up by a GP was really quite good. But anyway, the Guardian had a little bit more sort of sensible reporting of it. False widows not out to get us, and their bite isn't dangerous, don't panic, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it still happens every year, even all this years later. I think with COVID this year, it's not been quite as much of a problem as in previous years, simply because COVID has taken over the headlines and everything. So spiders are not too much reported. But just to look at the recording of this particular species, this was February 2012, and this is up to date, and this is the spread that it has had over the country during those past, 20 years or so. It was first recorded down in the southwest in 1875, so it's been here for a long period of time, and it has gradually been spreading across the country. It's only now that we begin to get worried about it. It's been here all this time. Anyway, moving on quickly. Money spiders. These are what a lot of people come across. They're out on a walk, and they sort of get a bit of silk across their face. They're walking through the woodland or whatever, and it's going to probably be the tiny little money spiders which are doing this. I quickly zoom through this because time is getting on. This is a typical type of web you might find in the hedgerow at this time of the year, belonging to something called Linyphiidae triangularis. This is one of the larger of the money spiders. There are some smaller ones, but some of them have really weird names. This is Paponocranium ludicum, and it's a very ludicrous head to it, a great swelling on its head. And here's another one, very difficult to see the photo, but it's got a very periscope-like head. And here are some drawings giving you some of the very strange head shapes for some of these tiny little money spiders. They are small. We're talking about 2, 3, 4 millimeters body length. But with a hand lens, you can actually just pick out some of these shapes sometimes. And when you're looking at them under a microscope, obviously these things become very obvious. It is a large family, and they're all of a similar sort of size, or many of them are similar sort of size, and many of them haven't got any real pattern to them. So they're not easy to identify. It's rather like moth people have macro moths and micro moths. And the macros are the ones people go to first. And then when they get really interested, they want to go a bit further, they start to look at the micros, which are much, much smaller. Rather similar with our British spiders. The family itself is the biggest, over, well, around about, I suppose, 270, 280 species. And that's almost a third of all British spiders are Linyphiids. So just an interesting thing about the Linyphiids is that we have this ballooning phenomenon which happens with all spiders, but the Linyphiid tend to express it. Well, we see it more often from Linyphiids. We're aware of it in a sense. Here we've got lots of tiny money spiders on the top of a fence post, and one might wonder why they're all there where there isn't any food or anything. Well, what they're doing is they're actually preparing to balloon. Now, here's one which is, you can see it's got its abdomen raised, and you can't see it on this photograph, but there's a line of silk which is being produced from the spinnerets at the tip of the abdomen there, just there. And we might end up with something like this, which some of you may be familiar with. It's what we call gossamer, and it's the result of, you know, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of tiny little money spiders in a field, all spinning silk at the same time. And they do this to disperse. They spin silk, and that gets picked up by the breeze, hopefully, and they'll drift off in the breeze, and that's how they move around. And if it's a particularly, you know, if there's a slight breeze on an autumn morning, which is when it usually occurs, you might get this appearance of what we call gossamer, which if you, that's the thinking behind where the word comes from, spread over the fields. And it is just the result of a huge number of spiders. I'll quickly move through, because we're just to have a quick look at some of the orb web spinners. Here's a typical orb web. You'll see there are a number of orb web spinners, and one can actually go some way towards identifying them by looking at the webs. These are the Tetragnathids, and they generally, if we look at the web, you'll see the web has an open section centrally. Whereas if we go through to the Araneidae genus, the web there isn't quite so much of an open section there, more of a hub to the web. And this is taken in a garden as a typical sort of garden spider web. And that's what we see, what we understand as an orb web, but we might have a number of different spiders producing that type of web. Some of the smaller one, well, a smaller one which we get in the garden that spins an orb web just over a single leaf is this little cucumber spider, Araneidae. A larger one that is nocturnal is Noctinea umbratica. So if you have a big web in your garden, you never see a spider in it, go and have a look at it at night, and you might see quite a large spider in there with a flattened abdomen sitting in the centre of the web. And this is the one we saw earlier on. This is Zigiella, or the telegraph spider, it's sometimes called, with its web, and there's the section missing, a clear section there with just a line of silk going through the middle. Very, very common. Less common, but becoming more so, I suppose, is the wasp spider, a recent addition to the British spider fauna. I say recent, it's recently spreading anyway, and so its distribution is coming up into the Midlands. It does have a special feature in its web called a stabilimentum, which is a band of silk going through the centre. Not quite really sure about what its purpose is, but it does help with identifying the spider. It's quite a big, distinctive looking thing. You can't really miss it when they're around. And their distribution, again, this was up to 2000, but you can see how they're spreading, probably as a result of climate change. This is current distribution measured this year. Very quickly look at wool spiders. These are the ones that don't spin a web of any description. They tend to run around on the forest floor, carrying their eggs up with them. And when the eggs are ready to hatch, the mum carries the young around. They climb up on mum's back, and she manages to run around for a few days with the young attached to her. Quite a large family, and some of them are extremely well camouflaged. This is one which likes living on sandy areas, and you can see its colouring and its patterning help it blend in marvellously with its background. And I think we'll just sort of quickly look at the nursery rose spider. Carries its egg sac underneath its body. Here's the sort of tent-like web it spins, which is very typical and quite conspicuous in May, June time. And the male has this particular characteristic of presenting the female with a gift prior to mating. What he does is he catches a fly and wraps it in silk and presents it to the female, and she is sort of occupied with that whilst the male goes about the business of mating. Now, this is known in 2 other spiders in the world, both in the Physora family. So to have one in the UK is pretty good. The other 2, I think one's in Japan and one's in South America somewhere. A much rarer member of the family is something called Dolomedes plantaris, and this is the other protected species we have in the UK. A lot of work has gone on to protect this and secure the populations of this species, and again, new populations have been bred through and have been located in suitable habitats close by the original area where it was found. So it's actually doing quite well at the moment. There are 1 or 2 more I could talk about, but I think we've probably gone on long enough, David. Shall we sort of go back to chat?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, because we've, it's been very interesting, by the way. We could basically sit here all evening looking at these spiders. But obviously, if you want to look at spiders, this is a book to look at. Now, I need to ask you a couple of questions, and what we'll do is we'll have all the questions that have been asked on the chat, as well as my questions and anyone else's questions that may come up in the next bit, in the party zone. So it leads me to ask you, just out of interest, what is your favourite invertebrate?
I'd have to say probably the zebra spider. I didn't show you. It's a little black and white jumping spider, and you get them on your garden walls in sunny conditions in the summer, and they're really quite interesting to watch because they can recognize you as a shape, and if you walk towards them, they sort of shuffle around and look at you, as they do with their prey. And this is how they catch their prey. They turn themselves around and then they actually leap onto their prey, usually successfully. If not, they sort of do a bungee jump and crawl back up, falling completely off the wall. But though they are really quite a nice little spider.
Yeah, I remember them from my youth as well. I used to love watching them and playing with them as a kid. Now, if you could be anywhere in this world, and notwithstanding the current scenario, where would you be?
Well, we were due to go out to the States earlier this year, but I couldn't go. And I would really like to go to the Grand Canyon, which is where we were going to visit. So that's where I would like to be.
Fantastic. Okay, well, listen, Zoomers, just to quickly let you know, but this week we've got two more coming up. In fact, yeah, two more. We've got Melissa Harrison tomorrow, which is going to be very popular. She's a nature writer, but I'm sure some of you may even have her books. And on Friday, we got Rick Simpson of Wader Quest talking about protecting the world's waders. So they're the last two for this week, or tomorrow and Thursday. And then next week we have some more, but go to the website and you'll find out all about who's actually going to be featured on In Conservation With. I'd like to, on behalf of all the Zoomers, thank you, Lawrence, for being here tonight and giving us a rough overview on spiders.
Thank you. Could I just, before we go completely, just sort of say about the new book that we have actually put in a section on eye arrangements, which you can actually will help enormously if you have a hand lens to get you to a spider family very, very quickly. So it is a second edition, and the fact that the second edition we felt was something we wanted to do was to include a bit more extra help and clues in how you could actually use the book efficiently and successfully. And looking at the section about eye arrangements and so on, we feel is a real help. So if any of you are interested, then do go out and get yourself a copy.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lawrence, and you take care of yourself.
Thank you.